The first ships appeared without warning, tearing through the sky like cracks in reality itself. Cities froze beneath their shadows as towering vessels hovered silently, their metallic surfaces reflecting a world they clearly did not fear. Humanity had imagined alien contact for centuries, but nothing prepared them for this. No greetings, no signals, just a calculated show of dominance. Within hours, global communications were overridden, and a single message echoed in every language. Earth was now under their control. Panic spread quickly, but so did resistance. Militaries mobilized, weapons were launched, and humanity fought back with everything it had. Yet the invaders barely reacted. Missiles dissolved before impact, jets lost power mid-air, and entire defense systems shut down as if they had never existed. It became painfully clear. This was not a war between equals. Days passed and something strange began to happen. The aliens didn't attack further, they observed. Massive structures descended into oceans, deserts and forests, scanning, analyzing, watching. Humans expected destruction, but instead, they were studied. Scientists, engineers, and even ordinary civilians began noticing patterns. The invaders were not interested in conquest in the traditional sense. They were searching for something. Meanwhile, small groups of humans began adapting, surviving without technology, communicating through old methods, organizing underground networks. And in those quiet pockets of resistance, something unexpected emerged. Not better weapons, but deeper cooperation. People who had once been divided by borders, beliefs, and languages began working together in ways never seen before. It was messy, imperfect, but undeniably powerful. Then came the shift. One of the alien ships descended not over a capital city, but a remote village. No weapons were fired. Instead, a single figure emerged. Tall, luminous, and visibly weakened. The being did not speak through machines this time. It struggled, almost collapsing, before projecting fragmented images directly into the minds of those nearby. What it showed changed everything. Their species was dying, not from war, but from something they could not understand, an internal collapse of their own biological and mental systems. They had conquered countless worlds, mastered energy and matter, but had lost something essential along the way. Emotion, connection, balance. They had come to Earth not just to conquer, but because they believed humanity might hold the answer. At first, no one believed it. After everything, the fear, the destruction of defenses, the arrogance, why should humanity help them? But the evidence became undeniable. The alien technology, once flawless, began failing. Ships flickered in the sky, their systems destabilized, and more of them began to descend, not as conquerors, but as beings on the edge of extinction. Human scientists worked alongside the visitors, struggling to understand their biology, while others offered something less measurable: compassion, patience, even faith. It turned out the one thing the aliens had never truly studied was the human ability to endure, to feel, to care even for those who had wronged them. Slowly, incredibly, a fragile alliance formed. In the end, Earth was never conquered, but it was forever changed. The aliens, once feared across galaxies, became students of humanity, and humanity, once divided and fragile, discovered its greatest strength was not in weapons or technology, but in its humanity itself. The war that never truly began became the moment everything shifted, not just for Earth, but for an entire civilization that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. And somewhere among the stars, a new story began to spread, not of a species that was conquered, but of one that taught its conquerors how to survive. The first sign wasn't the ships. It was the silence. At exactly 0917 UTC, every major satellite network on Earth went dark, not gradually, not with interference or distortion, but instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch on the entire planet. Air traffic control lost contact with hundreds of flights mid-sentence. Financial markets froze with numbers half updated on screens. News anchors paused, confused, touching their earpieces as if the problem might be local. Within seconds, panic began to ripple outward, invisible but accelerating, like cracks spreading through glass. Then came the sky. Across every continent, people looked up at the same time, though none could later explain why. The clouds above them didn't move, they parted. Not blown aside by wind, but pulled back with unnatural precision, revealing shapes that had not been there a moment before. Massive, geometric, impossible to measure with the eye alone. Some swore they were miles wide, others said they seemed close enough to touch. The ships made no sound, no engines, no heat distortion, just presence. In Lahore, traffic slowed to a standstill as drivers stepped out of their cars, necks craned upward. In New York, thousands gathered in the streets between skyscrapers, their reflections swallowed by the metallic surfaces hovering above. In Tokyo, commuters remained frozen on platforms, trains forgotten. For a brief moment, the world shared. Something rare, a single, unified realization. We are not alone, and whatever is here is far beyond us. The message came next. Every screen, phones, televisions, digital billboards, even devices that were powered off, flickered to life. There was no signal, no visible source, just a symbol at first, a shifting pattern of light that seemed to rearrange itself faster than the brain could fully process. Then, one by one, languages appeared. Arabic, English, Mandarin, Urdu, Spanish, hundreds more. Each message identical. In meaning, do not resist. Your world is now under our authority. There was no signature, no explanation, just certainty. Governments responded the only way they knew how, by preparing for war. Within minutes, emergency protocols were activated. Military bases locked down, fighter jets scrambled into the air, missile defense systems came online, submarines adjusted positions beneath the oceans, silent and ready. Leaders addressed their nations with carefully controlled urgency, urging calm while quietly authorizing force. But humanity had already lost something vital, the illusion of control. The first strike was launched over the Pacific. A coordinated effort designed not to destroy, but to test. Hypersonic missiles streaked upward, cutting through the sky with precision, targeting one of the smaller vessels hovering above open water. For a moment, it looked like it might work. The missiles closed in faster than anything humans had ever built. Then they stopped, not exploded, not deflected, stopped, frozen in midair, suspended like insects trapped in amber. The ocean below them remained still, unaffected. Then, slowly, almost casually, the missiles disassembled. Not shattered, not burned. They came apart piece by piece, their components separating as if guided by invisible hands, until nothing remained but drifting fragments dissolving into the atmosphere. Every military command center in the world saw it happen in real time. No one spoke. A second attempt followed, this time from land, then from multiple locations simultaneously. Different weapons, different approaches. The result was always the same. Total, effortless neutralization. Within hours, the conclusion became unavoidable. This was not a war humanity could win, but the invaders still didn't attack. That was what unsettled people the most. They didn't destroy cities. They didn't fire weapons. They didn't demand resources or issue further threats. They simply stayed. Hovering above major population centers, coastlines, and remote regions alike, as if positioning themselves with purpose no human could yet understand. Then, the structures began to descend. Unlike the ships, these were smaller, but no less alien. Massive pillars of dark material, smooth and seamless, lowering slowly from the underbellies of the vessels above. They embedded themselves into the earth with silent precision, one in the Sahara Desert, another deep in the Amazon rainforest, several in the oceans, vanishing beneath the surface without a ripple. One appeared in the mountains of northern Pakistan, its base cutting into rock as though the stone offered no resistance at all. Wherever they landed, strange effects followed. Animals fled the area in coordinated patterns as if guided by instinct. Electronic devices within a certain radius stopped functioning entirely. Compasses spun aimlessly. Even time seemed to behave differently. People reported moments stretching longer than they should, sounds arriving a fraction too late, shadows shifting without a clear source of light. Scientists scrambled to understand, but data was limited. Probes sent near the structures lost signal. Drones either shut down or returned with corrupted recordings, Frames skipping, images warping into shapes that didn't make sense when viewed later, and still, no direct attack. By the third day, panic had evolved into something quieter, but more dangerous. Confusion, fear of the unknown. People didn't know whether to run, hide, fight, or wait. Some cities emptied as residents fled into rural areas. Others became tense, crowded centers of rumor and speculation. But in the absence of clear answers, something unexpected began to emerge. People started helping each other, not in grand, heroic ways at first. Small things, sharing food, checking on neighbors, strangers offering shelter, communities organizing without waiting for instructions from above. In places where power had failed, people lit candles and gathered together instead of isolating. It wasn't universal. There was still fear, still conflict. But alongside it, something else was growing, something the invaders had not yet responded to, and perhaps had not anticipated at all. Connection, and far above them, within the silent, watching ships, something had begun to change. Not in their position, not in their technology, but in their understanding. At first, the world refused to believe what it was seeing. The images from the remote village spread slowly, passed hand to hand, device to device, carried by people rather than networks that still flickered unreliably under the influence of the alien presence. There was no official confirmation, no government statement, just fragments of recordings and testimonies that sounded too strange to be true. A towering being of light, collapsing like something fragile, not attacking, not commanding, asking for help. Most dismissed it as manipulation, a tactic. Humanity had already seen enough to know these beings were capable of anything. If they could stop missiles mid-air and silence entire defense systems, projecting illusions into human minds would be trivial. Military leaders warned against contact. Scientists demanded controlled environments. Religious figures debated whether this was a test, a punishment, or something beyond human understanding entirely. But doubt began to crack when the failures became impossible to hide. One of the largest ships, hovering above the Atlantic, flickered. It didn't explode. It didn't retreat. It faltered. Its surface, once perfectly smooth and reflective, began to ripple as if it were struggling to maintain its own form. For several seconds, it became almost transparent, revealing something inside, structures that did not align with any known geometry, constantly shifting, like a system trying to correct itself and failing. Then it stabilized again, but the damage was done. The footage spread faster than fear. The invaders were not invincible, and more importantly, they were not stable. Across the world, similar incidents followed. Smaller crafts lost altitude before recovering at the last moment. The pillars embedded in the earth began emitting irregular pulses, disrupting their own fields. In some regions, they simply shut down, standing silent and inert like monuments to a plan that was no longer working. Something was going wrong. The turning point came not from governments or militaries, but from a group no one had been watching closely. A cluster of independent researchers, medics, and engineers who had formed an underground network in the early days of the arrival. Cut off from centralized systems, they had been forced to rely on older tools, analog equipment, and direct observation. They had one advantage others did not. They were not trying to fight the aliens. They were trying to understand them. When word of the weakened alien in the village reached them, they moved quickly. Not with weapons, but with caution. Approaching. The site took hours, navigating through areas where electronics failed unpredictably and the air itself felt charged with something unfamiliar. The structure that had descended there stood partially open now, its surface fractured in ways that suggested it had not intended to be, and outside it, the being waited. It was smaller than people expected, not towering like a conqueror, but closer to human height, though its form was fluid, shifting at the edges like light trying to hold a shape. It didn't move aggressively when they approached. If anything, it seemed relieved. No one spoke at first. No one knew how. Then one of the medics stepped forward. She didn't raise her hands and surrender. She didn't make any grand gesture. She simply knelt beside the being, as she would with any patient, and waited. It was a small act, almost insignificant. In the scale of everything that was happening, But it was the first moment of true contact. The response was immediate, not through sound, but through sensation. Images flooded her mind, not in a sequence she could easily follow, but layered, overlapping, urgent. She saw stars, not as distant points of light, but as places, systems, networks of civilizations connected by something far more advanced than communication. She saw the alien species as they had once been, vibrant, interconnected, not unlike humanity in ways that were difficult to explain. And then she saw the change. It hadn't happened suddenly. It had taken generations. As their technology advanced, they began to optimize everything. Efficiency became their guiding principle. Emotions were studied, then regulated, then minimized. Connection was streamlined, then reduced, then eventually replaced by systems that mimicked it without the unpredictability. Conflict disappeared. So did suffering. But so did something else. Meaning. Without realizing it, they had removed the very processes that allowed them to adapt. Not just physically, but mentally, socially, even biologically. Their systems became perfect. And then, slowly, they began to fail. Not from external threats, but from within. A kind of collapse that had no clear cause because it was the result of everything working exactly as intended, until it didn't. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. Entire populations began to degrade, not dying in the traditional sense, but losing coherence, losing the ability to function as individuals or as a collective. Their technology kept them alive, but it couldn't fix what had been lost. So they searched across systems, across galaxies, looking for a species that still had what they no longer did: unpredictability, resilience, emotion, the capacity to connect in ways that couldn't be reduced to data. They found Earth. The medic collapsed, back slightly as the flood of images ended, her breath uneven. Around her, the others watched in stunned silence. She didn't need to explain everything. The look on her face was enough. "They're not here to destroy us," she said quietly. "They're here because they're dying." The being in front of her dimmed slightly, as if the act of sharing had cost it something. Its form flickered, unstable. For a moment, it looked like it might disappear entirely. Instinct took over. "Help me," she called. Not to the alien, but to the humans behind her, and they did. Not because they fully understood. Not because they trusted the situation, but because in that moment the choice was simple. Something was in front of them, suffering, and that was enough. They worked with what they had: basic medical tools, improvised equipment, observations instead of assumptions. It was messy, uncertain, and completely unlike anything they had trained for. The alien biology didn't respond to treatment in predictable ways. Its form shifted under their hands, its structure resisting analysis. But something unexpected happened. It stabilized. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough for it to remain. Word of this spread, not through official channels, but through people. Stories of contact that didn't end in destruction, of aliens that didn't attack but weakened, of humans who chose to help and saw a response. Slowly, cautiously, others began to try. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to matter. And far above them, in the ships that still watched in silence, a decision began to form. For the first time since their arrival, the invaders changed their approach, not by force, but by reaching back. The first coordinated response from the aliens did not come as a message. It came as absence. Across the planet, several of the massive ships that had once loomed over major cities began to rise. Slowly at first, then with growing speed, until they disappeared beyond the atmosphere. There was no sound, no light, no dramatic exit. One moment they were there, pressing their silent weight onto the minds of millions, and the next they were gone. People didn't celebrate. They watched. Because not all of them left. Roughly a third of the vessels remained in place, but their behavior changed. Their positions shifted away from dense population centers toward more isolated regions, deserts, oceans, mountain ranges. The towering pillars embedded across Earth began to dim, their constant low-frequency hum fading into something softer, almost passive. It was the first clear signal humanity received that something had shifted. Not surrender, not retreat, adjustment. Within days, new forms of contact began to emerge. Not the overwhelming, system-wide broadcast from before, but localized, controlled interactions. Small groups of humans, often those already involved in earlier encounters, reported the same experience. A presence, gentle but unmistakable, reaching out, not forcing, not commanding, but inviting. The underground networks became something else entirely. What had once been scattered clusters of survivors and independent thinkers began to connect into a loose, global web of cooperation. Without relying on unstable digital systems, they used analog radios, physical travel, handwritten records, methods that were slower but resilient. Information flowed through people, not machines, and what flowed most was a single realization. The aliens were trying to learn, not about human technology, not about military capability, about humans themselves. In one coastal region, a group of fishermen reported an encounter unlike anything else. A small alien craft had descended near the shoreline, its surface fractured and dim. When they approached cautiously, they felt the same mental contact others had described. But this time, the images were different, simpler, focused. The beings weren't showing their history. They were asking questions, not in words, but in experiences, memories of shared meals, moments of grief, acts of kindness between strangers. The fishermen didn't fully understand what was happening, but they responded instinctively, recalling their own lives, their own connections, families, losses, celebrations. The exchange lasted only minutes, but when it ended, the craft stabilized. Hundreds of miles away, similar encounters unfolded. A teacher in a small town found herself sharing memories of her students, of patience and frustration and quiet pride. A former soldier relived moments not of battle, but of choosing not to fire, of protecting rather than destroying. A child, barely 10 years old, simply shared what it felt like to trust someone completely. Each time, the result was the same. Stability. The pattern was undeniable now. The aliens weren't just studying humanity anymore. They were depending on it. But with that realization came tension. Not everyone agreed with what was happening. In government bunkers and secured facilities, debates turned into arguments, and arguments into fractures. Some leaders saw an opportunity to control the Chi situation, to leverage the aliens' weakness. Others saw a threat, an unknown force interacting directly with civilians, bypassing all authority. And some saw something even more dangerous. Change, because the more humans engaged with the aliens, the more something subtle began to shift within humanity itself. People who had participated in these exchanges described lingering effects, not physical, but perceptual. A heightened awareness of others, a deeper sensitivity to emotion. In some cases, an almost overwhelming sense of connection that was difficult to put into words. It wasn't universal. It didn't happen to everyone, but it was spreading. Religious groups interpreted it in different ways, some as a sign of unity, others as a loss of human identity. Scientists struggled to measure it. Psychologists debated whether it was real or a collective response to trauma. Meanwhile, the aliens grew more stable, not fully restored, not close, but improving. And then something unexpected happened. They gave something back. It started small. In one region where water purification systems had failed, a previously inactive alien structure emitted a brief pulse. Nearby, contaminated water cleared, not instantly, not magically, but accelerated, as if the natural processes had been pushed forward. In another area, failing crops began to recover under conditions that should have made growth impossible. The changes weren't dramatic enough to be called miracles, but they were undeniable. The aliens were learning from humanity and beginning to apply what they learned, not just to themselves, to Earth. This shifted the balance again. For the first time, the relationship was no longer one-sided. It wasn't just humans giving and aliens receiving. There was an exchange forming, uneven, fragile, but real. Still, not everyone trusted it. A faction within one of the remaining military coalitions made a decision. Quietly, without global consensus, they identified one of the weakened alien vessels positioned over an uninhabited desert region. It had shown repeated signs of instability, relying heavily on nearby human interaction zones to maintain function. To them, it represented both a risk and an opportunity. If the aliens could be helped, they could also be tested. The strike was prepared using methods designed to bypass previous failures, non-digital targeting, analog delivery systems, approaches that relied on unpredictability rather than precision. For a moment, it seemed like the old world was returning. A choice to fight. The weapon was launched at dawn. It moved differently than the others before it. Not faster, not more powerful, but less predictable. Its path shifted slightly, enough to avoid the precise interception that had neutralized previous attacks. It got closer than anything had before, and for the first time since the arrival, the alien vessel reacted with something that could only be described as urgency. The air around it distorted violently. The structure flickered, unstable, struggling, not just to defend itself, but to remain intact. Far away, across multiple regions, humans who had been part of the exchanges felt it. Felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of distress. Not fear in the way humans experienced it, but something deeper, a breakdown. A system failing under pressure it could no longer handle. Without understanding why, many of them reacted at the same time. They reached back. Memories, emotions, connections. Everything they had shared before. They pushed forward again, instinctively, urgently, across distances that should have made no sense. The effect spread, and the vessel stabilized. The weapon never reached it, not because it was destroyed, but because it simply stopped, falling harmlessly to the ground, inert. The silence that followed was heavier than any before it, because now, everyone understood something that could not be ignored. This was no longer a war, and it was no longer just first contact. It was something else entirely, something that blurred the line between species, between minds, between what it meant to survive alone and what it meant to survive together. And not everyone was ready for what came next. The world didn't split all at once. It happened quietly, like a fracture forming beneath the surface long before anyone could see it. On one side were those who had experienced the connection, the ones who had felt the alien presence not as an invasion, but as something fragile, searching, incomplete. On the other side were those who hadn't, who saw only what had arrived first: overwhelming power, global disruption, and a species capable of ending humanity in hours if it chose to. Both sides believed they were right. Both sides were afraid. Governments that still maintained some level of control began to reorganize, not around nations, but around ideology. Emergency councils formed, bringing together military leaders, scientists, and political figures who agreed on one thing: humanity could not afford to become dependent on an alien species, no matter how weakened it appeared. They called for containment, for strict regulation of all contact, for the isolation of regions where interactions were taking place. They called it protection, others called it fear. Because outside those controlled environments, something very different was happening. The exchanges between humans and aliens were becoming more structured, not organized by any central authority, but guided by repetition and understanding. Certain individuals showed a stronger ability to connect, to stabilize the alien beings through shared memory and emotion. They became bridges, whether they wanted to or not. Some of them were ordinary people, a teacher, a medic, a farmer, a child. Some of them began to change. It wasn't physical, at least not visibly, but their perception deepened in ways that set them apart. They could sense when an alien structure was destabilizing before any measurable signal appeared. They could interpret the fragmented images the aliens projected with increasing clarity. In some cases, they could even respond with intention, shaping what they shared instead of simply reacting. They were still human, but not entirely the same. That was enough to make them targets. In one region, a coordinated operation was launched to detain several of these individuals. It was fast, precise, and executed under the justification of containment and study. The goal was simple: understand what made them different, replicate it, control it. It didn't go as planned. When Nitru, the first group, was taken, something immediate and unexpected happened. Nearby alien structures destabilized, not gradually, but sharply, as if something essential had been removed. Their surfaces fractured, their fields collapsing in uneven waves that disrupted everything within miles. And then, for the first time since the shift began, the aliens acted without waiting, not with weapons, with presence. Multiple crafts descended simultaneously across different locations, not in formation, not with coordinated precision, but with urgency that bordered on desperation. They didn't attack the facilities. They didn't destroy the forces involved. They surrounded them. The air itself seemed to thicken. Movement slowed, sound distorted. Those inside the containment zones reported a pressure, not physical, but mental. Not pain, but intensity. As if something vast was trying to reach through layers it didn't fully understand, return them. The message wasn't broadcast, it was felt, not as a command, but as a need so strong it left no room for misinterpretation. Inside the facilities, the detained individuals reacted before anyone could issue orders. They didn't panic. They didn't resist. They reached out, just as they had before, and the response was immediate. The instability outside began to calm, but not completely. The connection was incomplete, strained by distance and interference. For the first time, the balance felt fragile, dangerously fragile. Back in the councils, the reaction was divided. Some saw this as proof that the aliens were still a threat, that their dependence made them unpredictable, capable of destabilizing entire regions if their needs weren't met. Others saw it differently, that humanity now held something the aliens could not survive without, and that using it as leverage could reshape the balance of power entirely. The word control started appearing more often, and that changed everything. Because the moment control became the goal, the nature of the connection began to shift. Those who had formed genuine exchanges with the aliens started to feel it first, a subtle resistance, like a signal being distorted. The clarity of the shared experiences weakened. The emotional depth flattened, becoming harder to sustain. The aliens were reacting, not aggressively, but defensively. They didn't understand human politics, strategy, or power structures. But they understood imbalance. They understood when something essential to their survival was being restricted, manipulated, or threatened, and their response was not to fight. It was to withdraw. Gradually, the connections weakened. Fewer exchanges, shorter durations. Less stability gained from each interaction. The improvements that had begun to appear, environmental recovery, system stabilization, slowed, then stalled. The progress that had brought both species to the edge of something new began to slip. And then came the collapse. Not global, not catastrophic in the way people had feared at the beginning, but precise. One of the largest remaining alien structures, positioned deep within an oceanic trench, failed completely. There was no explosion, no visible destruction. It simply stopped. The field it had been maintaining, something subtle, something no one had fully understood, vanished. And in its absence, something long suppressed surged back. Ocean currents shifted violently. Temperatures spiked in localized zones. Marine life patterns broke apart almost instantly, as if held together by something that was no longer there. The effects reached the surface within hours. Storm systems intensified without warning. Coastlines experienced sudden abnormal tides. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was a consequence. For the first time, humanity saw what the aliens had been quietly holding together, and what could happen if they failed. The message was clear, even without words. This was not a one-sided dependence. It never had been. Humanity needed them too. Maybe not for survival in the immediate sense, but for stability, for balance, for something deeper that no one had fully understood until it began. to disappear. And now, both sides were pulling away at the exact moment they needed each other most. Somewhere between fear and trust, between control and connection, a decision was forming, not from leaders, not from systems, but from individuals, the same kind of people, who had started this shift in the first place. Because if this continued, there would be no war, no victory, just two species, both capable of surviving alone for a while, choosing slowly and stubbornly to collapse instead. No one announced the decision. There was no global broadcast, no leader stepping forward to define what would happen next. The systems that once controlled information were still fractured, unreliable, and, by now, less trusted than the quiet, understanding spreading between people. It began the same way everything else had begun. With individuals, the ones who had felt the connection most deeply were the first to move, but this time they didn't stay where they were. They traveled, across cities, across borders, across distances that had once seemed impossible without modern systems. Some walked, some drove, some followed nothing but instinct and fragments of shared direction that didn't quite make sense. Until they arrived. They weren't gathering randomly, they were being drawn to the structures, to the silent places where the alien presence had weakened the most. Word spread, not through commands, but through trust. People didn't need full explanations anymore. They had seen enough, felt enough to understand what was at stake. And slowly, the movement grew. Not organized, not controlled, but unified in a way humanity had rarely experienced. They came not as soldiers, not as negotiators, but as participants. At first, the aliens didn't respond. The structures remained dim, their surfaces inert, their once active fields reduced to barely detectable traces. The ships above hovered without movement, like observers waiting for something they no longer knew how to initiate. The distance between the two species, once filled with overwhelming force, now felt like hesitation, uncertainty. Then someone stepped forward. It could have been anyone, a teacher, a medic, a stranger with nothing remarkable about them except the choice they made in that moment. They approached one of the silent structures and did what had once seemed impossible at the beginning of all this. They reached out, not physically, but inward. They didn't try to control the connection, didn't shape it, didn't direct it, didn't hold anything back. They let everything through. Memories, emotions, contradictions, fear, hope, pain, love. Not the polished version of humanity, not the idealized one, the real one. Messy, imperfect, alive. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the structure responded. A faint pulse, barely visible, moved across its surface, then another. The air around it shifted, not violently, but gently, like something waking after a long stillness. The connection returned, but this time, it was different. It wasn't one-sided. It wasn't humans giving and aliens receiving, or the other way, around. It flowed both directions at once, not as an exchange, but as a shared space, something neither species had fully experienced before, and it spread. One person became 10. 10 became hundreds. Across the planet, at every structure that still remained, the same pattern unfolded. People reached out, not with intent to fix, not with desire to gain, but with willingness to share. And the aliens responded, fully. What they shared was no longer fragmented or overwhelming. It was clear, focused, honest in a way that cut through all remaining doubt. They had not come to conquer. Not really. That had been the surface-level action, the only approach they still understood when they arrived. But beneath it, the truth was simpler and far more vulnerable than humanity had first imagined. They didn't know how to survive anymore, not as they were, and now, neither did humanity. Because somewhere along the way, without realizing it, both species had reached the same edge from different directions. The aliens had removed everything that made them unstable, and lost what made them alive. Humans had held on to that instability, emotion, conflict, unpredictability, but had built systems that slowly pulled them toward the same kind of disconnection. Different paths, same outcome. Until now. The connection deepened, not into something that erased individuality, but something that allowed both sides to experience each other without losing themselves. Humans felt the clarity, the structure, the vast knowledge the aliens had built across civilizations. The aliens felt something they had not experienced in generations. Raw, unfiltered emotion, not as data, but as reality. It was overwhelming. For both. But they didn't pull away, and that was the difference. The structures brightened, not with power, but with stability. The ships above shifted, not repositioning for dominance, but aligning in a pattern that mirrored the connections forming. Below, across oceans, deserts, cities, and mountains, the same process unfolded. Not a takeover, not an alliance in the traditional sense. Something new, something shared. The environmental instabilities began to ease. The oceanic disruption that had threatened. Coastlines slowed, then stabilized. Systems that had faltered, both alien and human, found balance again. Not through control, but through cooperation at a level no one had planned for. Back in the remaining centers of authority, the reaction was quiet. There were no more attempts to control it. No more strategies to weaponize what was happening. Because for the first time, it was clear that this was not something that could be owned, directed, or contained. It either existed freely, or not, at all. And humanity, for all its divisions, had made a choice, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Days passed, then weeks. The alien presence did not vanish, but it changed. Some ships left, returning to whatever lay beyond human understanding. Others remained, but no longer as silent overseers. They became part of the world in subtle ways, integrated into systems that were still being discovered, still being understood. The structures stayed, not as tools of observation, but as points of connection. And the people who had once been seen as different, the bridges between the two species, were no longer isolated. What they had experienced began to spread, slowly, naturally, not forced, but learned. Not everyone felt it. Not all at once, but it was there. The beginning of something that would take generations to fully understand. In the end, there was no victory, no surrender, no clear line where one story ended and another began. Just a shift, a moment where two civilizations, both on the edge of collapse in their own ways, chose not to pull back into themselves, but to move forward, into something uncertain, together, and far beyond Earth, in places humans would not see for a long time. The story began to spread, not of a species that had been conquered, but of one that had done something far more difficult. It had shared what made it human, and in doing so, reminded an entire civilization how to live again.